Hello YouTube! Eric's Projects back with another project on the style line. Today I'm going to start redo the open drive conversion that I started on this car about a year ago now. Originally I had started out, I pulled the transmission, torque tube, and the rear end out of here, and which is still over there leaning up against the wall. And I had got a transmission from a 1956 Chevy car. It was a 3-speed with the factory overdrive in it. That way I could keep my 3 on the tree gear shifter and still have the overdrive for making it a little nicer going down the highway for a daily driver. Well, if you know, you have to run a different bell housing for those transmissions, as well as any of the later ones. So I got a bell housing out of a 1962 Chevy car with the 6-cylinder in it. That way it had the old style mount where it mounts up to the engine and the new style bolt pattern for the transmission to bolt onto there. Now, pretty straightforward. I pulled my transmission, rear end, all that out of there, pulled the factory bell housing off, put the new bell housing on, and when I put the new bell housing on, I put the 1956 transmission up in there and everything fit great. Splines right into the stock clutch. Shift fork hits the throw-out bearing and just looked like it was going to work. Well, I was having a hard time finding the arms on the side of the transmission for the shifting linkage to hook up to. So I reused my stock arms and put on there and tried to bend my stock shift linkage to mate up to where the arms are. Now I'm going to tell you, the arms are certainly not in an ideal position at all. And pretty tough just bending things around to try to make it fit. Well, in the process of bending my shifting linkage back and forth so many times, I snapped one end of it off. And I found a few more on eBay, but you know, it seems like people want a lot of money for those sometimes, and to even find the little arms that go on the side of the 56 transmission is tough to find. So I decided just to scrap it. You know, I didn't want to do the T5 because I didn't want a shifter coming up through the floor. I wanted it to look original. I wanted it to look kind of period correct with the 3 on the tree, but I'm past that right now. So I've got a T5 out of a 1983 S10. So I got the 5-speed. It has a .86 overdrive. And so now I'm going to take that T5 and I'm going to bolt it up to the current bell housing that's on the car, the one that came off the 62. That way it has the right pattern for the transmission. And doing some reading on different forums and things, I've found a way to bolt this transmission up without the use of an adapter. And so that's what I'm going to start today. I'm going to show you. I'm going to put a T5 in this car without using an adapter. Just all stock parts, and there's only one, well, 2, but really one part you got to change, or 2 parts you modify, and real simple. You need to shorten the input shaft, the nose on it where it goes into the pilot bearing, and you need to shorten the bearing retainer. That's it. Simple swap. You don't have to get inside the transmission really at all. Unbolt the bearing retainer, change out the input shaft for a Jeep CJ T5 input shaft, which also has the 10 splines on it, so it will work with my stock clutch. No trying to find some Astrovan clutch or some weird collection of whatever. So this is going to bolt together with no adapter for the transmission and with my stock clutch that I can get off of Rock Auto or down at O'Reilly's or whatever, not having to modify any of that stuff. So with that being said, car's up on jack stands. So we'll get going. I'm going to get underneath there, and I need to pull out that 56 transmission now. All that's just the 4 bolts holding it on. So I'll pull that out and we'll start working on the T5, and I'll show you exactly what I'm doing with the T5 to make it bolt in. And after that, we'll move on to the rear end. In this car right now is a 1956 Chevy car rear end that I had bought. It has a 370 gear ratio. I re-drilled the pads to bolt onto the leaf springs. Wow, the wheel bearings on these things are expensive for the 56, 55, 57 cars. I ended up getting a set of just some knockoff Chinese ones, but I want a different gear ratio. 370 is too low of a gear ratio. I want to go with like a 342. That way it's just better for cruising, and being I only have a .86 overdrive, I don't want to run into the same problem where I'm high RPMs running down the freeway, 3,500 RPMs or so. Hey, Jasper. And so I'm going to go ahead and pull that rear end out. Say hi, Jasper. and put the S10 rear end in with the better gear ratio, and this thing should be a darn nice driver after that. So without further ado, let's get under the car. This is my shop cat, Jasper. He loves to hang out here. Okay, inside the car here, this is the 56 transmission. Right there is the Overdrive Solenoid for it. Transmission is actually in really good shape. Gear oil looks great inside. It's been stored inside its, its whole life out of a vehicle. Under a guy's workbench. He forgot he had it, found it, and I jumped on it and bought it, and now I'm not even going to use it. Pretty standard, 4 bolts there to bolt it up to the bell housing, and should lift right out. I've got a piece of flat steel there that I just stuck across for a cross member and trying to make that work. So go ahead and pull this out and we'll start working on that T5. Okay, here's that transmission bolted up. You see the shift fork there on the throwout bearing. Yeah, I mean, everything bolts up real good. I just hacked out my cross member there to make room for this, and we'll see what I'm going to do. I might see if Walton's got something, or if it's just a piece of flat steel is all I need, I'll just put one of those in there and make this thing work. So anyway, let's go ahead and get this thing out, and I'll lift it out and head to the T5. There's there's the rear end, the 56. I mean, like I said, spring pads are re-drilled. I just got some like trailer U-bolts and U-bolt plates and bolted it all on. Was going to weld a nut on the plate to put the shock on. Things line up pretty good, but just not what I want to use. Woohoo! Got it out. That was easy. Here's the T5. There's the numbers on it, which tells you it's a 0.86 overdrive, and I think it's got a 403 first gear on it, so it's pretty low first. This came out of an 83 S10. Go ahead and pull the cross member off and get another mount for that to mount onto the new cross member. Now, the part that we're going to change is the input shaft, because I think these have like a 27 spline or 21 spline, something like that, and then this bearing retainer is too long. The input shaft that we'll be using here, like I said, is out of a Jeep CJ. There's a part number. I just ordered it up off of eBay. It's like 60 bucks. And what this does for us is gives the 10 spline, same as your clutch. Got to cut, I think it's 3/4 of an inch or 7/8 of an inch off of this shaft here. That way it'll have the right depth to go into the pinion bearing or the throwout bearing. Put a new input shaft bearing on it here, and then on the inside you can take the current S10, that flat roller bearing, and drop it right in there, and as well as those individual rollers, and just put them right back in here. So the only thing I need to install on here is a new input shaft bearing. And if your input shaft bearing on your S10 one is good, you could probably pull it off and reuse it, but they're pretty inexpensive, and that way I can start new, so why risk it? So go ahead and I'll pull this bearing retainer off, pull the input shaft out, and we'll be ready for this one. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and just cut this first, and I'll give you the dimensions on cutting that, and as well as the bearing retainer, we need to cut this down too. Here's the 56 transmission out, and then this is the bearing retainer for the T5. You can see there's quite a bit of difference there. And so go ahead and I'm going to pull this out and measure it, and measure up this one and trim this off. I believe one out of a Camaro, a T5 off the Camaro, has the correct length bearing retainer also. So if you don't want to cut yours or you don't have one, you can just pick one up off a Camaro too. And I'll also take a measurement from the case where it mounts up to the bell housing to the end of the shaft here, just to be absolutely sure on how much we're cutting. And this is the 10 spline, and you can see how this one necks down, and on the Jeep one it doesn't neck down like this, so it's going to be a stronger input shaft also. Okay, distance from the transmission where it mounts to the bell housing up to the end of the input shaft is just over 6.5 inches there. It's like about 6 9/16. So that's where we'll make our measurement and our cut on the Jeep shaft. Okay, this bearing retainer is just over 3 inches from the mounting surface of the transmission. That's where we'll go ahead and trim this one. There's the bearing race, which we won't be using anyway because we'll be putting in a new one. So this one, the S10 one, the S10 one is, well, okay, the S10 one is right about 4.5 inches long. So we'll trim 1.5 inches off of that to match up to the 3-inch one here. Okay, with the Jeep shaft in, we're about, almost 7 1/4 as far as the stick out. So we need to take that back down to like that 6 9/16 there. So we'll go ahead and trim almost half of that shaft off, or the taper part of the shaft, and then this will be the correct length to go in. There we are, one freshly trimmed Jeep input shaft. National A5 bearing on there. I went ahead and sprayed it out since I put it on before I ground it. Poor choice. But now put the roller bearings in there and slip it inside the transmission. Alright, I went ahead and ground off the bearing retainer also. And ground off a little less than I initially thought. I went ahead and ground off the bearing retainer, and a little less than I thought. Currently about 3 3/4 inches from the mounting surface to the end of it, because that's where the splines started to taper back down, and that's what it looks like on the OEM one and on that 56. So some of the measurements I found on the internet, I'm sure different bell housings are a little different. So, you know, this isn't a truck bell housing, it's a car bell housing. So if this doesn't work, I'll pull it out and trim a little more. What you got to do on these T5s is take a 1/2 inch drill bit and ream out the hole. It's pretty close already, being these are a metric transmission, but the bolts that go through for the bell housing are standard. So ream these out 4.5 inch, and then you're ready to install. Okay, here it is, T5 bolted up to the bell housing, nice and flush. Bearing retainer is recessed in there a little bit. I ended up cutting about another 1/2 inch off of that bearing retainer because it was hitting the in the clutch disc, the fingers. But now I've got to get the fork on there onto the throwout bearing. This is the stock 1952 throwout bearing. Fits perfect on the S10 bearing retainer. Now I just got to fab up some sort of bell cross member to bolt up here, and man, I'll be good to go. Yeah, I'm not sure if a company has one or not. I think there's a couple companies out there that do have one, but heck, it just basically looks like a flat piece of steel going right across from frame rail to frame rail, and would mount that in just fine. So maybe that's what I'll end up doing. But there it is, T5. Bolted up to a 216 with no adapters and real inexpensive parts. So I hope this part helps somebody. I'm going to continue on this open drive conversion. I've got to quit for the day and get some other work done, but I'll be back at this.